The Great Fire of London began innocuously enough as a fire on the premises of the baker Thomas Fariner in Pudding Lane during the early hours of Sunday, the 2nd of September 1666. Fariner was understandably reluctant to bear the responsibility for so great a disaster and insisted that it was not because of his negligence. He claimed that the fire in the oven of his bakehouse had been extinguished at about 10 o'clock the previous evening. Only one grate had any smouldering embers at that time, and they had been raked over. And the doors and the windows were closed to prevent drafts through the buildings. But it was his practice to place a stock of fuel next to the oven so that it would be dry enough to relight the fire in the morning. And according to one account, it was actually in the oven. Fariner's fire should have been just one of those blazes which occurred from time to time in any community, where fires were lit for warmth, cooking, in furnaces, ovens and stoves, with candles for light, and fire carried from place to place to avoid kindling a new one. Of course, the risk was greater in an urban environment because the density of buildings made it difficult to isolate a fire. But with a prompt and well-organised response, fires were generally put out without great loss, and the flames at Fariner's should have been extinguished quite quickly. All urban communities took steps to minimise the risks of destructive blazes through control of building materials, especially prohibiting thatched roofs, which was enforced in London from the early 13th century. At the end of the 16th century, John Stow attributed the absence of large-scale fires in the city to that policy. The bulk of the houses were timber-framed, with lath and plaster infilling, standing several stories high in the main streets, with the upper stories jutted forward. This is Cheapside in 1638. And as the high street, effectively the high street of the city, it had grand buildings, and it was also a wide street. But in terms of the height and the jettying, which is quite clear, it's probably not uncharacteristic of the more important streets. But there was much shoddy building in the alleys and courts, where 1/3 of the city's population of more than, say, 400,000 lived. Holler's plan of the pre-fire city shows the form of the city just before the fire. The suburbs have started to grow, there's growth along the river, but the bulk of the city is still in the core within the city walls. Timber building was in decline as brick became the fashionable material. Its use was stipulated in building regulations issued by successive governments from 1580, which also imposed minimum standards of construction and prohibited the subdivision of houses. Those issued in 1620 addressed the use of timber and the congestion of buildings, and specified that the upper stories should not project outwards above the street. A proclamation in 1625 stated the policy for London of reducing the houses and dwellings to a more orderly and uniform manner of building with brick for more ornament, strength and safety and continuance. And an Act of Parliament of 1657 that was designed to perk up the policy required that new buildings should be built with brick or stone or both and straight up, without butting or jetting out into the street, lane or place. This was aimed at producing uniform frontages, as well as being designed to save timber, with the further objective of the prevention of the burning and firing of houses. For the same reason, the parish officers' duties included inquiring if any baker or brewer bake or brew with straw or any other fuel which may endanger firing, and also investigating the premises of such who use any fire presses for pressing or dressing of nether stockings, woolen clothes, or other things, all armourers and other artificers using to work in metals which have or use any places dangerous for fire. Firefighting equipment was kept by the officers of the local units of the wards and parishes, And the corporation required that every parish should have hooks, ladders, buckets and scoops in readiness upon any occasion. This is a depiction of the Great Fire at Tiverton in 1612. You can see how the hooks are used. There are plenty of buckets for the firefighters going up the ladder. But the other significant thing, I think, is that the minister and the citizens are standing away so that the firefighters are unimpeded, because the organisation of firefighting was of paramount importance. There are no fire engines in that print because they had not yet been introduced into England. The first were brought in the 1620s, and by the early 1660s they had been widely adopted as their design and effectiveness were steadily improved. That is a fire engine contemporary with the Great Fire. You can see how it works. A bucket chain is formed. There's two lines of people. The full buckets are passed down, the water is tipped into the tank, and the empties go back on the parallel line of people. And the pumps are like that. But at this date, the water shooting from the nozzle was intermittent. Each time the pump was used, it went. Not until the early 18th century was a valve devised which kept a continuous flow. Nevertheless, that is top-of-the-range firefighting at the time of the Great Fire. Some were small and quite robust and could be carried upstairs within a building, as were the handheld squirts. That is a 19th century drawing, so not terribly accurate. And that looks very much like the syringe which Dad used to use in the greenhouse when I was a boy. Much the same principle, you suck it in and blow it out. Anyway, perhaps the greatest incentive in the prevention of fires was self-interest. For however assiduous the household was in taking care with fire and flammable materials, a careless neighbour could bring disaster, the loss of buildings and goods, and the suspension of business until new premises could be found. There was no fire insurance. Charitable help from collections was typically both generous and inadequate. Generous in the sense that money was given, inadequate in the sense that it wasn't enough, and in any case, it took time to arrive. And so in an urban community, everyone should have been careful and watchful, reporting dangerous practices. Despite all of that, the blaze in Farriner's bakehouse was not quenched, and he and his family fled the premises as the flames spread through the buildings. Effective firefighting depends on the speed and decisiveness of the response as soon as the alarm is raised, before the fire can develop. In that respect, the conditions in early September 1666 were against the firefighters. It had been a hot, dry summer across much of Europe, and in England, both July and August were warmer than any of the corresponding months during the previous 7 years, literally since records began, because we don't have a temperature series before 1659. Both 1665 and 66 were also unusually dry years, and the parched summer of 1665 was succeeded by a long drought in southeast England that began in November 1665 and continued until September 1666. And worse than that, over the days when the fire blazed, there was a strong gale blowing from the east, whipping in across the estuary, which fanned the flames. At that time of the year, stocks of provisions and fuel were at their maximum, laid in ready for the winter. Added to the problem caused by the high wind was the fact that this part of the city was a difficult one to deal with in terms of a major fire. Pudding Lane ran northwards from Thames Street to Eastcheap in an area of narrow streets and alleys, close built with wooden pitched areas. This is Newcourt's map of 1658. That is the north end of the bridge, Gracechurch Street, and Pudding Lane, that's Thames Street. Pudding Lane is that street there. Farriner's buildings were on the east side. And you can see it's densely built, very difficult. Many of the occupiers were tradesmen dealing in flammable goods relating to shipping and seaborne commerce. The excavation of a cellar in Pudding Lane has shown that barrels of pitch, a caulking agent, were stored there, and that the building above was timber framed with a tiled roof. Those premises were entirely typical of the Thames Street area, which contained old paper buildings and the most combustible matter of tar, pitch, hemp, rosin and flax, while the nearby wharves were stacked with timber and coal. So what of the response to the alarm? A witness later claimed that the fire did not spread from Farriner's house to the adjoining properties for an hour. Whether that was an exaggeration or not, a next-door neighbour was able to remove his goods before his house caught fire. But the flames gradually took hold of the nearby premises, and by 3 o'clock in the morning, the fire was prominent enough for Samuel Pepys' servants in Seething Lane, over a quarter of a mile away, to be aware of it. Jane Birch, the maid, called her master, telling him that there was a great fire in the city, but after watching for some time and judging where the fire was, and that it was far enough off, Pepys went back to bed. Many others would have reacted in the same way, because fewer people needed to be up and about as early on a Sunday morning as they would have done on a weekday. It's one of the misfortunes that Farriner's fire began on a Sunday morning. After the alarm had been raised with a great noise of drums, the Lord Mayor, Sir Thomas Bloodworth, was called to the scene from his house in Aldersgate, and having assessed the situation, was said to have remarked that a woman might piss it out. Whether he did not say that or not, it was held against him thereafter. There was a flyer distributed in the city shortly after the fire, which said that, the fire had grown to a big conflagration, although a rich man and a stout did say at first he'd piss it out. That was held against him, as was the allegation that he refused to order the demolition of nearby properties to create a fire break, which was a common practice in such an emergency, reportedly asking, when the houses are being brought down, who shall pay the charge of rebuilding them? He and his officers clearly did not think this fire was an unduly dangerous one, but they made the wrong call. A later judgment was that by the time that 15 or 16 houses had caught fire, the chance of containing the blaze in the strong wind had already passed, and Farriner's fire was already well on the way to becoming the Great Fire. The wind drove the flames through the buildings, creating heat, smoke, ash, and flying debris, which made firefighting almost impossibly difficult. The firefighters' problems were exacerbated by the crowded streets as the citizens moved their possessions to safety, on foot, by cart, by whatever means they could find. This is an anonymous painting, about 1670, which shows the process at Ludgate. With streams of citizens carrying their goods, bringing them out and dumping them where they think it will be safe. That is the nighttime view, and the light is from the flames, but Thomas Wick's drawing shows a much smokier sky. Admittedly, that's a drawing, not a painting, but I think that is probably more accurate. The smoke would have been the big problem for the firefighters. Initially, those whose houses were threatened moved their goods relatively short distances, only to realise fairly quickly that they had to take them further away. As the area threatened with destruction grew, so did the number of people whose premises were endangered. The Thames was a possible escape route for those living close to the waterfront, and Pepys described it as full of lighters and boats loaded with their belongings, while other goods were floating in the water. John Evelyn wrote that the river was covered with goods floating, all the barges and boats laden with what some had time and courage to save. That was an appealing image, and Philip de Luthberg painted this to demonstrate it, but that's a painting of the very end of the 18th century, about 1797. But he does attempt to convey not so much the panic, but just the desperation of the citizens to move their goods. The flames mostly drove westwards, but they also made progress northwards, and more slowly, because against the wind, eastwards towards the Tower, so that houses on Tower Hill were demolished as a precaution. If only Bloodworth had done that earlier. This German print, because obviously after the fire, it attracted international attention. This German print shows the extent of the fire and correctly has it been blown from east to west between the temple to the left and the tower to the right. But of course, not all of the area was in flames at once. The fire would have broken up into separate fires and progressed at different speeds, and I think probably not progressed that quickly. The king ordered the establishment of 8 fire posts around the conflagration from which the firefighting would be coordinated, and he put the Duke of York in overall control. But the fire post in Coleman Street had to be abandoned as the flames threatened. There just was no stopping the fires with the means and manpower available, and those who lived within the threatened area would surely have been more concerned about their houses and possessions than with firefighting. Only when the wind dropped on the Wednesday could the fires be brought under control and then quite quickly quenched. The fire destroyed property in an area of 436 3/4 acres. We can be precise because there was a detailed survey made immediately after the fire, which Wenceslas Holler incorporated onto the map, which I showed earlier. I mean, that is so self-evident it doesn't require explanation. The area to the northeast within the walls escaped. You can see predominantly the fire burned west and northwest. The flames destroyed St Paul's Cathedral, 87 churches, 6 consecrated chapels, 52 livery halls, the Custom House, the Royal Exchange, the Blackwell Hall, Newgate Prison, Bridewell, the Compters, debtors' prisons, at Wood Street and Poultry, and the Sessions House. The Guildhall was gutted, but was repairable. The fire had not reached the Strand, to the west, Westminster, the northern and eastern suburbs, or Southwark. And it was estimated that the 13,200 houses destroyed were but a 1/5 part of the whole. Farriner's maid was one of at least 6 people who died during the fire. There may have been a few more, not recorded, but there was no contemporary claims that dozens of people were killed, and had they been, surely those claims would have been made. The numbers of houses destroyed suggest that at least 65,000 people were made homeless, but almost 80,000 may be closer to the truth, at a time when Norwich, the next largest English city, contained fewer than 30,000 inhabitants. The losses for houses and contents can be put at almost £8 million, while the detailed estimate made in 1720, which included the cost of reconstructing the public buildings and erecting the monument as a memorial to the disaster, produced a figure of slightly more than £10.75 million. By way of comparison, the government's revenue that was set after the restoration in 1660 by Parliament was £1.25 million a year. I think that's a multiple of over 8. Those who had lost their rental income from properties that had been destroyed included not only individuals, the livery companies and the London charities, but also many in the provinces who drew an income from properties in the city bequeathed to them by people who had gone to London and made good and remembered their relatives and home communities in their wills. And so the fire had a far wider impact than just in the area that was gutted. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, most of those who had been made homeless settled briefly in the open areas around the city. They were the people, late of London, now of the fields, who lived, some under tents, others under miserable huts and hovels, without a rag or any necessary utensils, bed or board. Yet all of them quickly found somewhere to stay, which is quite impressive. According to the Earl of Clarendon, in 4 days, in all the fields about the town, which had seemed covered with those whose habitations were burned, and with the goods which they had saved, there was scarce a man to be seen. The Great Fire was blamed by some moralists on the sinfulness of Londoners, as the Great Plague in the previous year had been. The courtiers, on the other hand, were said to have derived a certain smug satisfaction from this, that the city, a potentially dangerous political opponent, had been enfeebled by the fire. The returning royalists had blamed it not only for Charles I's defeat in the Civil War, when it had resolutely supported Parliament, but more seriously for failing to intervene to prevent his execution in 1649. Some Whigs took a less earnest, non-political view, and because the fire began in Pudding Lane and ended at Pye Corner on the fringe of Smithfield, they claimed that the overriding sin was gluttony, and the figure of a fat boy was put up at Pye Corner, where it still is, with the inscription on the tablet below, "This boy is in memory put up for the late fire of London, occasioned by the sin of gluttony, 1666. A far more highly charged statement blaming the disaster on the Papists was set on the plinth of the monument. It was taken down during James II's reign, 1685 to the end of 1688, but then replaced, and it wasn't finally removed until, would you believe, 1830. As well as such practical considerations as accommodation and the arrangement of new marketplaces, almost immediately after the fire, there was much optimism that London would emerge from the disaster as the most noble city that can be. That could be achieved through the architectural uniformity already aspired to in the legislation over the previous 86 years. To accomplish that, and to prevent over-hasty and shoddy rebuilding, regulations are issued in 1667, aimed at achieving such uniformity and preventing the return of cottages in the alleys and courts. Houses were classified according to their site in 4 categories. The smallest ones were of 2 stories and garrets in the by streets and lanes. Those of the second sort were of 3 stories and garrets. They were on the streets and lanes of note and facing the river. Those in the next category were 1 story higher, and they fronted the high and principal streets. And the 4th category would have been too individualistic to have been shown in this way. They were mansion houses for citizens and other persons of extraordinary quality, and not necessarily standing on the street frontages, but nevertheless also limited to 4 stories. All houses had to conform to those categories, and the desired appearance was furthered by a ruling that the roof lines within the first 3 sorts of houses should be uniform. The regulations also contained detailed stipulations concerning the height of stories, depths of cellars, and thicknesses of the walls. Bow windows and other projections were prohibited, although houses fronting the high streets could be fitted with balconies so long as they were no more than 4 feet deep. The earlier insistence on brick and stone was repeated, and control of materials was extended by banning wood from the outside of all buildings except for window frames, door cases and cornices, and shop fronts, which had to be of oak, which was relatively fire resistant but also relatively expensive. One major issue to be resolved was the responsibility for undertaking the rebuilding of a property. And in that case, a blaze amongst the buildings at the northern end of London Bridge in 1633, which had wrecked about 1/3 of the houses on the bridge itself and nearly 80 more in the parish of St Magnus the Martyr, became significant. Disputes over the liability for rebuilding led to long delays, and the buildings on the bridge had not been reconstructed by 1666. Claude de Jong painted a view of the bridge looking downstream just before the 1633 fire, and that painting was repainted after the fire. This late 20th century redrawing of the 2 de Jong paintings shows, fairly obviously, the buildings on the bridge, which are left in cream, not detailed, which are the ones which were destroyed in 1633 and had not been rebuilt. And the fact that you can see the parapet of the bridge all the way along shows that that's how it was after the fire. That was significant for 2 reasons. One is that, of course, it created quite a long fire break so that the Great Fire didn't spread to Southwark, which experienced its own Great Fire 10 years later. But the vacant sites in such a prominent position were visible evidence of the consequences of wrangling over the rights or liabilities to rebuild. While the fire was burning, there was some wild talk of arsonists and fifth columnists who could take advantage of the confusion and seize the city for the Dutch or the French, with whom England was then at war. The French were the preferred arsonists because they were Catholics. Some people were arrested or roughly handled during the fire as suspects, and some were taken into protective custody. It was in that atmosphere that Robert Hubert was arrested in Romford a few days after the fire, after bragging that he had started it. He was the son of a watchmaker in Rouen and had worked as a watchmaker there and in London. He confessed to the Justice of the Peace who examined him that he had started the conflagration. He was indicted at the Middlesex Sessions on the 16th of September and imprisoned in the White Lion prison in Southwark. After he was imprisoned, he changed his story so that it agreed with what was known about the origin of the fire, which was surely being widely discussed. In fact, a boy who was just 10 years old told Lord Lovelace how he and his family, abetted by a Dutchman, had started the blaze in Pudding Lane with fireballs. Nevertheless, attention was focused on Hubert. There was no convincing evidence against him, except that he was unerringly able to go to the site of Farriner's premises among the ruins and describe the house's appearance and the window into which he had pushed a lighted fireball of gunpowder, brimstone, and other flammable materials on the end of a pole. Familiarity with the building and the ability to find ruins which were understandably attracting much attention as the seat of the fire was scarcely convincing proof, while his various accounts were unsatisfactory and riddled with contradictions. Farriner, his son and daughter, signed the true bill against Hubert, which is required before Hubert was indicted and went to trial. But they also maintained that there was no window in the place he described and that the fire had not started in that part of the building. Well, of course it hadn't, because the bakehouse would be in the yard, not on the street front. Yet Hubert was convicted at the City Sessions in October on his own confession, and I'm tempted to say on his own insistence, and was hanged at Tyburn. The mood of the time required that he should be a Catholic. He and his family were known to be Protestants, and so it was alleged that he had been converted while in prison by the Queen Mother's confessor, and he had died a Roman Catholic. The obligation to maintain a property lay with the tenant, but then who would invest in a new building when they could only get the benefit for the remaining years of their lease? The exception which was allowed was when a property had been damaged by a foreigner. After the fire, the judges upheld existing opinion regarding leaseholders' liability, but also concluded that they were not responsible in this case because the burning had been caused by an enemy, none other than Hubert, whose conviction was a convenient legal scapegoat for the fire. Hence Pepys's comment that it was an excellent salvo for the tenants. Hubert's confession and conviction were indeed mightily convenient in the context of the preparations for rebuilding. Yet they were directly contrary to the government's consistently held view that the fire had been an accident. Hubert's death, I'm sorry to say, is a nasty story. Even by the standards of the late 17th century, it's a nasty story. With the legal liability settled, landlords and tenants were able to agree terms for rebuilding, and a court was established to deal specifically with disputes relating to the destroyed property, avoiding the interminable delays in the equity courts. And so that kind of problem was avoided. Such differences, the stringent regulations and the straitjacket of the building types specified in the Act did not discourage progress. Most of the new houses were built by 1672, very impressive, I think, and the majority of the livery companies' halls by the late 1670s. The Royal Exchange, the Custom House, Guildhall, and other public buildings were also rebuilt within a short time, and the monument was finished in 1676, Sutton Nichols's view of the early 18th century, and I show it partly for the monument itself, also for the buildings around it. If you don't know it, you haven't climbed it, there is a gallery there. Some years ago, I did an interview, a radio interview, on the gallery about the Great Fire, and that was a breathless occasion as well. A secondary building act in 1670 provided for the construction of St Paul's and 51 churches, 31 fewer than the number destroyed. Christopher Wren was given overall control, and he designed the new churches with assistance in some cases from Robert Hooke. All of them were in use by 1696, although some steeples and towers were added later. St Paul's took far longer, begun in 1675. The first service was indeed held in 1697, but the building was completed only in 1710, and officially in 1711. That's Canaletto's painting, and I show it not because you won't know what St Paul's look like, but I think that there's a danger of becoming so familiar with it that we forget how good it is. The skyline formed by the churches and the great dome of St Paul's was in marked contrast to that of the pre-fire city, but was appealing because of the very lack of uniformity in the towers and steeples. So uniformity is the thing which is aspired to, but it's Wren's variety which is appealing, also by Canaletto. The appearance of the streets had also undergone a dramatic change. This is Addle Hill, the Painter Stainer's Hall. Notice that it's on a slope. Well, it would be Addle Hill. This new city was much admired by Dr. John Woodward, physician and antiquarian, in 1707, when he wrote that the Great Fire, however disastrous it might be to the then inhabitants, had proved infinitely beneficial to their posterity. And by the historian John Strype, who did a revision in 1720, a massive revision of Stowe's Survey of London. Divers churches, the stately Guildhall, many halls of companies and other public edifices, all infinitely more uniform, more solid and more magnificent than before. Yet although the buildings were praised, the hoped-for university along the street frontages had not been achieved. And it was misleading to write that since the burning, all London is built uniformly, the streets broader, the houses all of one form and height. That was not the case, because small units of ownership, differences in decoration, balconies, doorways, and the stepped effect caused by streets built on an incline had all prevented the creation of uniform frontages. The developer Nicholas Barbon wrote that a house's appearance owed much to the trade of the master builder responsible for it, whether he was a bricklayer, stonemason, glazier, or carpenter. Variety in the appearance of the facades was produced by the differing finishes of the brick. The regulations had not been specific enough to prevent such effects, could scarcely have been. Economic practicality also explains why most of the alleys and courts were rebuilt, although the King's proclamation of the 13th of September, just a week after the fire was extinguished, had planned to remove them. And in his proposals for rebuilding, Richard Newcourt had hoped to do away with the multitude of by-lanes, rooks and alleys huddled up, one on the neck of another. They were rebuilt because affordable housing within the city was needed, and that need took precedence over aesthetic judgments. But the regulations did successfully prevent the building of tenements in the back streets and courts. At the other end of the social scale, the wealthy merchants did not move away from the city after the fire, but built fine houses on enlarged sites. Yet, despite the money and pride lavished upon them, such complexes were generally not up to date in stylistic terms, with a house built not on the street front, but continuing the long-established practice in London of placing it at the rear of a courtyard, flanked by warehouses and offices. So the opportunity of putting your showy house on the street front where everyone could see it wasn't taken. Tradition won out. The overall effect produced by disappointment as well as praise, the architect Nicholas Hawksmoor was particularly severe, contrasting the convenient, regular, well-built city that might have risen from the ashes with the reality which he described as a chaos of dirty, rotten sheds, always tumbling or taking fire, with winding, crooked passages scarce practicable, lakes of mud and rills of stinking mire running through them. Despite such complaints, the policy of using former street plans can be seen as well judged and a success. And the most innovative of the regulations, the house types laid down in the Rebuilding Act, far from proving an irksome restriction, were taken up by builders and erected in the areas newly developed during the capital's expansion in the late 17th century. Landlords wishing to control the kind of building to be erected on their ground adopted that terminology of house types, specifying the rate of house to be built long before it was given formal expression in the Building Act, of 1774. What London did first, other places followed, with the Rebuilding Acts obtained after fires in Northampton in 1675, Southwark, which is the fire I referred to earlier, 1676, Warwick, 1694, Blandford Forum and Tiverton, both in 1731, Wareham in 1765, and last and smallest of all, not entirely explicable, the small town of Chudley in Devon in 1807. And other towns mimicked London's materials and styles when rebuilding after fires, following the growing fashion. Uniformity of appearances and a new street plan could only have come with large-scale changes of ownership and a rearrangement of sites. Indeed, with the implementation of the kind of ideas that were considered immediately after the fire, but dismissed as impracticable. Half a dozen plans to radically redesign the street layout within the city were produced, aimed at creating a model Renaissance city on a new layout. This is John Evelyn's plan. You can see the essential principles: round points and piazzas with streets radiating from them, and St. Paul's on the top of the hill. But the disappointment with rebuilding came to centre on the failure to implement Christopher Wren's plan, which is bigger and bolder, possibly less complex than Evelyn's. This train of criticism can be traced back to the 1730s and was furthered by the architect John Gwynne, who produced a version of the plan in 1649, claiming that it had been approved by Parliament and then unhappily defeated by faction. It was given added credibility in Parentalia, an account of Wren's work written by his son, edited by his grandson Stephen Wren, and published in 1750. Stephen Wren blamed the self-interest of the citizens with their obstinate averseness to alter their old properties. And he claimed that it had been shown at the time that it could have been carried through without loss to any man or infringement of any property. The image conjured up was a powerful one of scheming opponents and unimaginative and obstructive citizens. And this was often repeated, despite its divergence from the truth. Wren's plan certainly had an appeal for later generations, and the portrayal of the visionary architect whose proposals were frustrated by narrow-minded and selfish dullards helped to fuel the disappointment. That disappointment continued into the 20th century, despite Thomas Redaway's study of the rebuilding, published in 1940, which demonstrated convincingly that the financial and administrative means to implement such a complete replanning were just not available. Neither the corporation nor certainly the Crown could have financed the compensation needed for property owners and their tenants. Nor was there a civil service large and able enough to oversee the necessary transfer of property. The process would have been very slow, contentious, and a speedy rebuilding was the overriding priority. In any case, the bright new city that was built did not survive intact for very long. From the early 18th century, the post-fire buildings, typically constructed on leases of no more than 60 years, and so not all that well built, were gradually replaced by houses and shops, later by warehouses and offices. This process was carried out with some enthusiasm in the 19th century, when classical uniformity was much out of favour and even some of Wren's post-fire churches were demolished without regret. The replacement process was given added impetus by further fires. In 1715, a boy in a house in Thames Street was mixing his father's gunpowder to make fireworks when he made some kind of mistake. Of course, you never know what the mistake was. And he detonated an explosion that blew up the house and started a blaze which ran along the street and burned as many as 100 houses and the custom house before it was brought under control. As in 1666, Thames Street was at risk from fire because of the large stocks of flammable goods on the quays and in the riverside sheds. But another blaze in 1748 in Cornhill and Exchange Alley began at a wig maker's, and the nearby buildings were coffee houses, which were surely not great fire risks in themselves. Nevertheless, it burned about 90 houses. So the enforcement of building in brick and tile, minimising the amount of external woodwork, removing tenements and preventing the subdivision of buildings, still did not prevent multiple house fires within the area rebuilt after 1666. There was talk after the 1715 fire that the problem was a chaotic response. No one took responsibility, everyone tried to lend a hand, but I don't know. The Great Fire is usually regarded as a major disaster, destroying 1/5 of the city's buildings in the year after the Great Plague had killed 1/5 of its population. The conflagration surely had an awful impact on those whose property and goods were destroyed, and those who tried to stem the flames, or even those who just watched it. It's an experience sure that would stay with you. But it did provide a boost for business, with the replacement of the fuel and supplies for the coming winter, and then materials and labour to erect the new buildings and to restock the workshops and shops. The pioneering statistician John Graunt had calculated that the population recovered to its former level within 2 years of the major epidemics in 1603 and 1625, in both of which the proportion of the population that died was similar to that in 1665. And that also applied after the Great Plague, despite the destruction and disruption caused by the fire. The number of burials is an indication of population change. The average number of burials for 1668 to 72, when the houses were being completed, was almost 7% higher than for 1660 to 64, before the plague. And coal shipments from Newcastle to London in 1667 to 71, after the disaster, were at the same level as they had been in the first 5 years of the decade. And, most telling of all, London continued to grow from a population of upwards of 400,000 in 1650 to 575,000 by the end of the century. The demographic pattern in the late 17th century was that national population peaked around about 1650 and then stagnated and even possibly fell a little. So when London grew during that period, the proportion of the national population living in the metropolis increased from under 8% to over 11%. It was clearly still attractive, despite the two disasters. Buildings, after all, are the expression of a community, not its essence. And skills, acumen, determination, industriousness, and business connections were not destroyed. Nor was much of the city's portable wealth. The merchant's capital was in coin, gold, bonds, and paper instruments, and they were removed in advance of the flames. And their bullion was stored in the tower. Many of the artisans' tools were movable, and some of their stocks may have been saved. Those who lived close to Pudding Lane may not have been able to remove as much as they would have liked, but the fire burned for 4 days, and so householders in the districts which the fire reached on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday had ample time to take their possessions away. Even on the first day, according to Pepys, the citizens were able to rescue their keyboard instruments, which he saw on the boats in the river. Some people left London in the aftermath of the fire, sure, but they set up in business elsewhere, and the effect of that surely was to strengthen the contacts between London and their new city, for they would continue to do business with those they had dealt with in London. Nor did the fire initiate the trend for retailers in luxury goods to follow their wealthy customers to the Strand and the West End, which was just beginning to develop, because that process was already underway and would have occurred anyway. And it certainly was not the reason for the end of the plague, as was so often said. The conjunction with the fire with the ending of the plague epidemics in Britain, the last death from plague is at Rotherhithe in 1679, was assumed to be a case of direct cause and effect, with the fire acting as a purifying agent, cleansing the poisonous filtrations from the ground on which the city stood. But only 1/5 of just this one city had been destroyed in the blaze. It's not possible to have a good disaster, but the impact of a catastrophe does depend upon the state of the community affected at the time when it was affected. One which was struggling economically would clearly find recovery difficult. The examples in that respect would be Buckingham after a fire in 1725 and Tiverton after its big fire in 1731. But London in the mid-1660s was a prosperous city that continued to thrive, and the fire, although making a huge visible impact in its centre, did not impair its prosperity or growth. It's difficult to conclude that such a dramatic event was just a glitch when seen in the city's longer history, a hiccup on the high road of history, to coin a phrase. But we should perhaps at least consider that possibility. Thank you.